If you have never understood Buddhism, the reason is almost never what you think. It is not that the teaching is too subtle, or that you are missing some quality others have. Most of what you have heard about it reached you in the wrong order. Nothing is wrong with you. The whole of it is still waiting, intact. So let your shoulders drop. Let the breath you have been half holding leave you. For the next few hours, you are going to hear Buddhism the way it was first spoken, when it was still a quiet man on a road, saying what he had found to other tired people. You will meet him at the edge of a river the night he almost died. You will hear what he actually meant by suffering, which is not what they told you at school. Somewhere along the way, the word for the quiet restlessness that has been running underneath your wanting for years will be given to you. And you will come, eventually, to a fire that goes out and a path that loops back on itself so that beginning anywhere is already beginning everywhere. Wherever you are listening from tonight, a kitchen somewhere cold, a car parked in the rain, a bedroom with a phone face down on the blankets. Settle in. We would love to know where in the world you are. Wherever you are, notice the small weight of the day you have been carrying, the hour that would not end, the message you have been refreshing, the thought you have been pacing around for days without managing to set down, the conversation you keep having in your head with someone who is not in the room. Your body probably already knows the weight we are talking about. There is a place in the chest, somewhere behind the breastbone, that has been holding it for you. It is possible you are someone whose life, from the outside, looks largely in order. The bills are mostly paid. The relationships are mostly fine. The career, the apartment, the friendships, each of them has a shape you could show to a stranger without apology. And yet there is a place inside you that none of that touches. A room in the house nobody has been in for a while. A corner of the heart that does not get warm no matter how many good things happen in the other corners. It is the place the dinners with friends do not reach, and the morning runs do not reach, and the good book, and the good wine, and the good weekend do not reach either. You may have tried, more than once, to name what lives there. You may have called it burnout, or midlife, or a rough patch, or a phase, or the effect of not sleeping enough. You may have called it stress, or overthinking, or your personality. Your GP may have mentioned a holiday. Your friends may have mentioned their own version. Your wellness app may have mentioned hydration. Some of those are partly true, and the part that is not explained by any of them is the part we are meeting tonight. It shows up at strange hours. 3 a.m, most often. The house quiet. The fridge making the low sound it makes when no one is listening. Your body too tired to keep pretending. Something in you that has been walking all day finally sits down. And you feel it. A weight that is not about any one thing. Not the argument. Not the deadline. Not the message you wish you had sent differently. Something underneath all of that. A low, steady hum. It is a frequency the rest of the day has been drowning out, and at 3 a.m, the day has finally gone quiet enough to hear it. You may have decided, over the years, that this hum is your fault, that other people do not have it, that if you were more disciplined, more grateful, more spiritual, more adjusted, it would be gone by now. You may have gone to therapy and gotten better at managing it without ever quite naming it. You may have gone to workout classes and to self-help podcasts and to meditation apps and to every new idea that promised the correct rearrangement of your life. You may have changed jobs. You may have changed cities. You may have changed the person you came home to. Some of those changes helped. Some of them mattered in ways you still cannot measure. None of them, if you are honest, went all the way down to where the hum lives. What we would like to say, quietly, is this. The hum is older than you. It is older than anyone you know. It has been sat with, in one room or another, by every human being who ever paid attention for long enough. It is not a symptom of something having gone wrong in your life. It is a feature of being alive inside a life that is always changing, in a body that is always changing, with a mind that keeps wanting the changing to stop. The fact that you are even noticing it is the beginning of something. A long time ago, in a country whose name you would have to look up, a man who had every comfort of his era sat down one afternoon and realized, in a direct and simple way, that everything he had was subject to change. His father was getting older. His friends were getting older. The beautiful things in his house would someday not be beautiful. The healthy people around him would not always be healthy. The child he loved would grow up and be a different person. And he himself, the one sitting there noticing, was also subject to all of it. This recognition did not come to him as a philosophical proposition. It came the way it is coming to you tonight, as a quiet, inescapable feeling that something in the structure of the ordinary life he had been leading did not quite hold together. He could have done what most of us do when this feeling arrives. He could have distracted himself. He could have doubled down on the comforts. He could have thrown a party. He could have called a friend or gone out or busied himself until the feeling passed. He could have told himself he was being morbid. He did none of those things. He sat with it. And the sitting with it, alone in the middle of a life that looked beautiful from every angle, was the first moment of something that would eventually be called a path. There is a line in one of the oldest Buddhist poems, a poem that gathered together the sayings of that man and the people who walked with him, that reads, in the plainest English, "Long is the night to the sleepless. Long is the road to the weary. Long is the cycle of confusion for those who do not yet know what they are looking for." Read it again, slowly, because it is for you. You do not have to have memorized anything to receive those lines. You have lived them. You have been awake at 3 a.m. You have walked roads that would not end. You have looked for something you could not name and could not stop looking for. That poem is one of the first places this tradition tries to meet you. It meets you by saying, first, that the ache is accurate. Here is the strange gift the tradition is going to give you, right at the beginning. It is not going to tell you the ache is a mistake you should get rid of. It is going to tell you the ache is a kind of correctly functioning instrument. Something in you has been picking up a real signal. The signal says, the way I have been trying to build my life is not a stable place to stand. The signal says, there is a gap between the surface of my life and the ground of it, and no amount of rearranging the surface is going to close the gap. That is the truth the signal has been carrying. And then, in the next breath, the tradition says something else that almost no one teaches clearly in the first hour. Something in you is also right. The part of you that wakes up at 3 a.m. and will not be satisfied with the usual reassurances, that part is awake. It has been waiting, patiently, for the rest of you to catch up. The refusal to be talked out of it is not stubbornness. It is clarity. Something in you has known, for longer than you have been able to name it, that the usual answers are not quite the right size for the question you have been carrying. The ache and the attention are the same thing. The thing that hurts and the thing that is looking clearly at why it hurts are one function of your mind, wearing two faces. When you begin to notice the ache, you are also beginning to notice the part of you that notices. That noticing is itself the first movement of everything that comes after. There is a word for what you have been feeling. It is an ordinary word, describing an ordinary experience, which happens to have been looked at more carefully by this tradition than by almost anyone else in human history. You will meet the word in a little while. When you do, the ache stays where it is. What shifts is your posture toward it. You will be able to put it down for the first time without feeling that you have to apologize for it. For tonight, let us stay with the recognition. The hum has been in you. The hum has been in people for a very long time. You are, whether you know it or not, sitting in a very full room. The room includes the people who wrote the poem about the sleepless night. It includes every monk and every farmer and every parent at 3 a.m. who ever wondered why the small unhappiness would not resolve. It includes the man we are about to meet. It includes the people listening to this with you tonight. It includes you. So let us sit here for a moment longer before we begin to move. You have been carrying something you did not know was allowed to be put down. The simple fact of being told that you can put it down is, for some listeners, already the beginning of sleep. Let that happen if it wants to. The rest of what we have to say will still be here in the morning. Whatever part of this lands tonight is the part that was ready. A long time ago, in a garden that was already beautiful in every way a garden can be beautiful, there was a man who had access to every possible distraction from this feeling. He had food on request. He had music on request. He had company on request. He had more than most of us could imagine having, and he had it arranged so carefully that a stranger looking in would have said, with some envy, that this was a man who had nothing to be unhappy about. And one night, without telling anyone, he walked out of the garden. He walked out quietly. There was no rebellion in it. He had simply realized, with the same quietness that is arriving in you now, that nothing inside those walls was going to answer the question he had begun to hear. Where he went next is one of the oldest stories in the world. The road outside the garden was made of dust. His feet had never touched dust before. The sandals he had been given were thin, and the heat of the ground came through them, and the small stones came through them, and the first night out in the open his body did not know how to sleep. In the garden there had been cool sheets, and the small sound of water in the courtyard, and a servant at the door. On the road, there was the smell of animals, and the low talk of other travelers at the fire, and the strangeness of being a man no one was serving. He was hungry in a way he had never been hungry. In the garden, hunger had been a signal that a meal was about to arrive. On the road, it was something that simply stayed. He learned, in the first weeks, that the body without its comforts is a loud instrument. It complained at every hour. It wanted what it had always been given, and he watched it complain, and he did not yet know what to do with the watching. He only knew that the watching was new. In the garden, the body's voice had been drowned in the voice of servants answering it. On the road, the body's voice was the only voice, and it had a great deal to say. He went to the people who were said to know. There was a teacher by the name of Alara Kalama, known across the region for a training in which the mind could be brought into deep stillness, a stillness so complete that the noise of the body quieted and the mind rested in a kind of vast, open spaciousness. The young seeker learned it quickly. He had always been quick with what could be learned. Alara Kalama, seeing this, said that he had reached what there was to reach and invited him to stay and teach alongside him. He did not stay. The stillness had been real. It had been, for stretches of hours, the most peaceful thing he had ever felt. And then the hours had ended, and he had stood up, and the old weight had been waiting for him where he had left it. The stillness had not reached the place the weight lived. It had given him a rest from noticing the weight without changing anything underneath. He bowed to the teacher. He thanked him. He walked on. He found a second teacher, Uddaka Ramaputta, who offered a training that went further still, into a stillness so refined that the sense of self nearly dissolved, into a territory that felt, while he was in it, like the edge of the answer he had been looking for. He learned that one too. Uddaka Ramaputta, seeing this, offered him the same invitation. He did not stay there either, because when he came out of the stillness, the weight was still in the place it had always been. It had grown patient. It had learned to wait for him. He understood something, standing in the road after leaving the second teacher. The most refined states of mind anyone in his part of the world knew how to reach were not going to close the gap he was trying to close. There was something in him that even the deepest absorption could not reach, because the absorption was still a technique, and techniques are things the self performs, and the thing he was looking for was underneath the self that was performing them. If refinement would not do it, perhaps force would. He went into the forests where the men who had given up everything lived. He joined them. He ate less, and then almost nothing. He sat motionless for longer stretches than a body is meant to sit motionless. He held his breath for as long as breath could be held. He slept on thorns. He did, for 6 years, every extreme thing the ascetic traditions of that place had discovered that a human body could survive. He grew so thin that when he reached to touch his stomach, his hand found his backbone. His hair fell out in patches. His skin turned dark, and then grey, and then the colour of old bark. The men he sat with began to watch him with a kind of reverence, because they had never seen anyone go this far. He became, among them, a sort of legend. Something in him was proving, with the only instrument he had, that he could take more than any of them. And still the weight did not lift. One afternoon, sitting under a tree, he fainted. When he came back to himself, slowly, he understood that he had almost died, and that the dying would have meant nothing. It would have been one more tired man giving his body to the forest. The weight he had set out to find the ground underneath would have stayed where it was, and it would have passed into another life, and another, in whatever way weight passes. He lay there for a long while, his cheek against the earth, listening to his own heart arrive slowly back into his chest. He could feel the dry leaves near his hand, and he understood, in that plain way that the body sometimes understands for the mind, that the direction he had been walking had been wrong from the beginning. It was then that a memory returned to him. A memory from when he was a boy, before the garden had walls, before the teachers, before the forest. His father had taken him to a ploughing festival, and he had been set down in the shade of a rose apple tree while the ceremony went on in the field. He had not been asked to do anything. He had not been trying to achieve anything. And sitting there in the shade of the rose apple tree, a small boy watching the dust rise from the turned earth, he had felt a stillness arrive in him without being invited. The stillness under the rose apple tree had not been produced. It had not been forced, and it had not been earned, and it had not required the destruction of his body. It had arrived because nothing in him was reaching for anything. He had been a boy sitting in shade, and the mind, left alone, had found its own quiet, the way water, left alone, finds its own level. Sitting under the tree where he had fainted, he saw it clearly, for the first time. Extreme effort was not the path. It was the same grasping he had seen in the garden, wearing different robes. In the garden, the grasping had been for pleasure. In the forest, the grasping had been for the escape from pleasure. Both were shapes of the same hand, closing around the same hope that if only he held on tightly enough to the right thing, the weight would finally lift. The garden had failed him, and the extremes had failed him, because both had been strategies, and the strategies had been different answers to the same unexamined question. The question had been, how do I make this feeling stop? And every answer, no matter how beautiful, no matter how disciplined, no matter how refined, had been an attempt to outmaneuver something that could not be outmaneuvered. Cleverness had failed against it. Strength had failed against it. Purity had failed against it. The feeling was a signal, and the signal was waiting for a different kind of response. The signal was asking to be understood. It wanted the kind of attention, the kind of simple listening that you give to a person in pain when you stop trying to fix them and simply sit down and begin to hear what they have actually been saying. Argument could not reach it. Endurance could not reach it. Starvation had proved with 6 years of evidence that it could not reach it. He had been so busy trying to reach the end of the feeling that he had never stopped long enough to look at the feeling itself. The feeling, looked at directly, was a traveler in the same house he lived in, a traveler who had been trying to tell him something for a long time, and who had only grown louder because no one had been home to hear it. 6 years of trying to silence it had been 6 years of refusing to answer the door. A woman from a nearby village, by the name of Sujata, found him by the river. She had been looking for a forest spirit to thank for a small kindness she believed she had received, and she came upon a man so thin she mistook him for one. She had brought a bowl of milk and rice, prepared as an offering. He took it. The other ascetics, watching from a distance, saw him eat and turned away in disgust. He did not mind. Something in him had already stopped needing their approval, because their approval had been another form of the grasping he was learning to see. The milk and the rice went into him, and slowly, over days, his body began to return. The strength came back into his legs. The color came back into his face. The other men, seeing this, decided he had given up. They left him. They walked off into the forest to find someone still willing to hurt themselves the way they were hurting themselves. He watched them go. He let them go. He did not try to explain. He understood, now, what he had not understood before. Between the pleasure of the garden and the refusal of pleasure in the forest, there was a third place, a place neither of those paths had been willing to go near. A steadiness that did not depend on anything being a particular way. An attention that was not reaching toward the next moment and not recoiling from this one. A way of standing in the middle of a life without grabbing at it and without pushing it away. This third place would one day be given a name that traveled far enough to reach the room you are sitting in tonight. It would be called the Middle Way. He crossed the river. On the other side, he found a tree. It was a fig tree, wide and old and quiet, with roots that had settled into the earth the way a body settles into a chair it has sat in for years. He walked slowly toward it. He cleared a small space at its base. He folded a few handfuls of grass for a seat. He sat down. He made, at that moment, a very simple decision. He would not get up from this seat until he had looked, all the way, into the thing he had been looking at from a distance for 6 years. No strategy, no extreme, no reaching, only the steady attention a boy under a rose apple tree had given without knowing he was giving it, turned now, with the full clarity of a grown man, on the weight he had carried out of the garden and across 6 years of forest. He would sit quietly, and he would look, and the looking would slowly do its own work, however long it took. The light was going down. The sky over the river turned the color of beaten copper. A village nearby was lighting its small evening fires. He sat, and the light moved across the earth in front of him, and he did not move with it. Whatever he was about to see that night would, in the months and years after, be named. It would be given a shape you could carry, a shape you could hand to another person, a shape that could cross oceans. But the naming had not happened yet. For now, there was only a man under a tree, and the weight he had come to see, and the last of the daylight settling onto both of them. By the morning under the fig tree, the man had a name for what he had been looking at for 6 years. The name would travel. It would cross oceans and be translated into languages he never spoke and be handled carelessly by thousands. And still, at the center of it, the precise thing it was pointing at would remain. That precise thing does not live in temples. It does not live in the forests he had walked. It lives in a place much closer to you. It lives in the Sunday afternoon after a wedding. The laughter has gone home, and the good wine is finished, and the flowers are already beginning to let their petals fall, and you are walking through rooms that still smell faintly of what had been alive in them the day before. It lives in the last hour of a holiday you have been looking forward to for months. The bag already half packed, the plane ticket already printed, something in you already crossing back to the life you came from. It lives in the flat quiet that arrives 3 days after the promotion, once the congratulations have stopped, and you are left with the same mind in a slightly better chair. You know the texture. You have met it all your life, and most of the time you have not had a word for it. Grief is sharper and more specific and knows what it has lost. Sadness is a weather the whole sky shares. What you are meeting in the Sunday quiet is smaller and stranger and nearer than either. A second knowing inside the first. Even as you were holding the good thing, something in you was already registering the small quiver of its changing, and that quiver, noticed or not, was the weight you carried into the evening. The name he gave it, in the language he spoke, does not translate cleanly. It is usually rendered as suffering, which is too loud, or as pain, which is too narrow. The word he used points at something quieter, more pervasive, and more honest than either. A steady, low-grade unsatisfactoriness. The quality conditioned experience has of never quite being able to hold its own weight. We will use the English word unsatisfactoriness from here because the original has been said and missaid so many times that the shape of it has started to wobble. The teaching he gave about this unsatisfactoriness was precise. It came in 3 layers, and each layer is recognizable in your own week. The first layer is the one you already know as suffering. The headache that will not lift, the loss that leaves the house too quiet, the news on the screen that takes something out of your chest before you have decided what to think about it, the body that hurts in a specific place, the mind that grieves in a specific place. This is the plain, honest pain of being in a body in a changing world, and the tradition does not pretend it is not real. It is the first and most obvious edge of the unsatisfactoriness. Were the teaching to stop here, it would be news to no one. The second layer is less obvious and more interesting and more useful. It is the unsatisfactoriness that lives inside the things that are going well, the meal that is good and is ending, the child that is small and will grow, the friendship that is easy and is subject to distance and illness and misunderstanding and time, the song you love that will finish, the afternoon you have been waiting for, that arrives and is lovely and is already leaving while you are still inside it. Every pleasant experience carries, folded invisibly into itself, the simple fact that it is not going to last. That folded fact is a weight. It is small and constant, and it is part of why even the good days leave you tired. The third layer is the quietest and the most important. It is the unsatisfactoriness that lives in the very structure of a conditioned experience, regardless of whether that experience is pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. It is the subtle restlessness underneath even a calm moment, the small lean forward into what is about to happen, the mind's inability to rest in a now that is not going to be now for very long. You can feel it if you sit still and watch. There is a minute tremor underneath the stillness, a kind of hum the system makes simply by being a system that has to keep renewing itself. Every breath is also the ending of the last breath. Every moment is also the departure of the moment before. That tremor is the third face of the thing he named. If this sounds abstract, try it for 1 minute. Let the breath move as it wants to move. Put down the looking for any particular feeling. Watch, for just 60 seconds, what the mind does while you are not asking it to do anything. It will lean. It will lean toward the next thing, and toward the last thing, and toward a faint rechecking of whether the minute is nearly up. That leaning is the tremor. It is the sound a conditioned mind makes while it is being a conditioned mind. Almost every first introduction to this teaching goes wrong in the same place. The listener hears the 3 layers, feels them land, and arrives at the conclusion that the teacher is saying that life is bad, that even the good parts are ruined, that happiness is an illusion, and the only honest response is a kind of dignified sadness. He was not saying that. He was being precise in a way that almost no one is ever precise. Joy is joy when it arises. Love is worth having. An ordinary Tuesday has its own light. The precision was about a smaller and more useful thing. Every conditioned experience carries within it, as a feature of being conditioned, an inherent instability, a small, steady incapacity to be what we keep trying to make it be, permanent, solid, self-contained, enough. The project we have been running, for as long as we have been running anything, has been the project of making it be those things. We have been rearranging the furniture of our lives, changing the partner, changing the job, changing the city, changing the diet, changing the hair, changing the app, trying to arrive at a configuration of conditions stable enough to hold the weight we keep trying to set on it. And the configurations keep failing us because the problem was never in the arrangement. The problem was in what we were asking the arrangement to do. Here the teaching turns, quietly, from a diagnosis into something more like relief. If the unsatisfactoriness is structural, the exhausting project of rearranging is something you are allowed to set down. Conditions matter. What they cannot do is the thing you have been asking them to do. You can still change the job. You can still leave the wrong relationship. You can still move to the better city. The tradition is not asking you to become passive. It is telling you what those moves can and cannot solve. And the clarity on that point is, for a listener who has been rearranging for 30 years, the first real breath. For as long as you have been alive, part of you has been working. Part of you has been managing the conditions, improving them, arguing with them, trying to get them into a shape that would finally allow you to relax. The teaching is not calling that part of you a fool. It is telling that part, with great tenderness, that the job it has been doing is not the job that will end the ache. The ache is waiting on a different kind of seeing. Something in you, hearing this clearly, exhales in a way the body has been wanting to exhale for years. There is a story the tradition tells about this very moment. A monk named Malunkyaputta came to the Buddha with a list of metaphysical questions that had been bothering him for years. Is the world eternal? Is it not eternal? Is the self the same as the body? Is the self different from the body? The kind of questions that a bright, restless mind will chase through every hour of its life without ever touching the edge of any of them. They make you feel for a few minutes as if you are doing the real work. He told the Buddha, with some heat, that if the Buddha could not answer these questions, he would leave the training. The Buddha did not answer the questions. Instead, he offered an image. Imagine a man, he said, who has been struck by a poisoned arrow. His friends bring a doctor. The doctor bends to pull the arrow out, and the wounded man says, "Wait, I will not have this arrow pulled until I know who shot it. I will not have this arrow pulled until I know what kind of wood the arrow was made of. I will not have this arrow pulled until I know the name of the village the archer came from." That man, the Buddha said, would die before any of his questions were answered. Some of those questions had answers. Some of them were even interesting. The point of the image lay somewhere else. There was an arrow in the wounded man, and the arrow was the thing the unsatisfactoriness actually was, and anything that distracted from the pulling of the arrow, however clever, was a kind of siding with the suffering instead of the ending of it. You have been the man with the arrow. You have been asking, instead of pulling, "Why did this happen to me? Whose fault is it? What does it say about me that it keeps happening? Will it happen again? When will the real answer arrive?" These questions have their place, and the tradition is not squeamish about them. It is simply, with great kindness, pointing at the arrow while you are asking about the archer. Come back, for a moment, to the Sunday afternoon. The wedding is over. The house is empty. The small, familiar unsatisfactoriness is present in the air. You have, in this moment, a choice that you have never quite seen clearly before. You can begin rearranging. You can decide that the afternoon feels this way because the wedding was not quite what it should have been, or because the right people did not come, or because you are in the wrong relationship, or the wrong career, or the wrong decade. Or you can pause for the first time and notice that the weight you are feeling is what a conditioned experience feels like when it is ending. That noticing does not make the afternoon less quiet. The quiet is still there. The flowers are still letting their petals fall. The house still smells faintly of what was alive in it yesterday. What you are carrying now has a different character. It is the plain, recognizable texture of being alive in a body in a world of change. And when that shift happens, even once, something in you quietly stops bracing. You are left, in that stopping, with a question of your own. A question that arrives with a different flavor than the metaphysical ones. If the unsatisfactoriness is structural, and if rearranging the conditions cannot cure it, then what, exactly, can? The question has the shape of a door. It is a door that opens on its own, in the next breath. Because the man who sat under the tree did not stop at the diagnosis. Having named what was structural, he turned, in the next movement of the same night, to the question of what was actually doing the structuring. What is it, inside the ordinary mind, that keeps laying the same weight onto every conditioned experience? What mechanism, as invisible as gravity, is always already at work before we have made any choices at all? He had seen the weight. He now turned to the hand that had been carrying it. For tonight, stay with the first seeing. You have been in more Sunday afternoons than you can count. You have carried the folded weight inside the good days, and the sharper weight inside the hard ones, and the steady hum that lives in both. You have, perhaps without knowing it, already had glimpses of what it is to set down the rearranging. A moment on a walk, a conversation where you stopped explaining, an evening when you simply let the thing end. Those glimpses were early visits to a room a trained mind will one day live inside. They were not accidents. They were the room meeting you while you were passing through. The training begins with naming the mechanism. The name is being held in a hand that is about to open. The hand opens. The name inside the hand is a word you already know before he offers it, because you have felt it in your own body 1,000 times. In the language he spoke, it is tanha. In English, it is thirst. Thirst is a quality of the mind. The small, continuous reaching that runs under a life like an underground stream, shaping everything on the surface without ever quite coming into view. You have been inside it for every hour you can remember, and you have not been taught how to see it. It is simpler than the mind wants it to be. Thirst is the small forward lean, the reaching for the next sip even while the sip you are holding is still inside your mouth. The eye that has already moved on from the face it is looking at, checking for the next face. The breath that has already started composing the next sentence while a friend is still speaking. The half second between the end of a song and the thought, what next? The Buddha, looking at the mechanism that night, saw that it moves in 3 directions, and that most human suffering lives inside one of the 3. The 3 are not separate people inside you. They are 3 expressions of the same underlying motion, meeting 3 different kinds of moment. The first direction is the simplest. It is the thirst for what feels pleasant. The second piece of chocolate after you have already decided you do not need another. The scroll that continues past the thing you are actually looking for. The third glass of wine that turns a good evening into a slightly less good one. The half hour you spend imagining the weekend when you are supposed to be working. It is not that any of these things is bad. It is that the reaching for them is itself a kind of tiredness, and the reaching does not stop when the thing arrives. The reaching moves on to the next thing almost before the current one has been tasted. You have noticed this if you have ever eaten the meal you were looking forward to all week and found yourself, halfway through, already wondering what you would have for dinner tomorrow. The meal was not broken. Nothing was wrong with it. The mind simply could not stay with the taste of what was in your mouth, because the mind had already moved, quietly, to the next possible pleasure. The second direction of the thirst is subtler, and for most listeners it is the one that runs the deepest damage. It is the thirst to be something, to become, to continue, to solidify into a version of yourself that is recognizable, admired, stable, real. It is the thirst that drives you to check, in a conversation, how you are coming across. The thirst that makes the photo of the meal more important than the meal. The thirst that keeps revising the story of your life inside your head, casting yourself in it again and again, adjusting the lighting. You feel it most clearly when it is threatened. Someone criticizes the work. A conversation does not go the way you wanted it to. An email arrives that makes the version of yourself you had been quietly building seem less solid than it was a minute ago. Notice what happens in the body at that moment. There is a tightening, a small rehearsing of defenses, a reaching for the reassurance that will patch the crack. That tightening is the second thirst, trying to hold together something that was never meant to be held together in that way. The third direction is the one least often named, and once you have seen it, you will find it living inside you more often than you would like. It is the thirst for what is here to stop being here, the thirst to disappear, the thirst for the difficult feeling to not be a feeling anymore, the thirst for the conversation to be over, the thirst for the decade to be done. It is not always dramatic. Much of the time it wears the face of impatience, the traffic that should not be happening, the queue that should be moving, the feeling in the chest that should not be in the chest. When the Buddha first taught, in a grove of deer near Varanasi, he called these three motions the cause of the ache. Not the pain itself, not the circumstances, the small, constant reaching that the mind keeps doing underneath every circumstance, reaching toward the pleasant, reaching toward a version of self to hold on to, reaching away from what is presently here. Three motions, in three directions, all of them a quiet form of the same thing. Not long after that first teaching, he walked to a hillside outside the town of Gaya, and he spoke to 1,000 fire-tending ascetics who had just left their fires behind to follow him. He did not tell them they had been foolish. He told them something stranger. He said, "Everything is burning. The eye is burning. The ear is burning. The mind is burning. The thoughts that arise in the mind are burning. Burning with what? With the fire of craving, with the fire of aversion, with the fire of not seeing clearly." The image was precise, and for his listeners, who had spent their lives building and tending literal fires as a spiritual practice, the image cut straight through. The fires they had been feeding all those years were already, always, burning inside them. You do not have to have tended a fire in the forest for this to apply to you. Sit for 1 minute in a waiting room. Watch the mind. It is burning. It is burning at a low, steady temperature that you have grown so used to that you mistake it for the weather of being alive. A small heat of wanting. A small heat of not wanting. A small heat of watching the clock. The burning is not dramatic. It is ordinary. It is what keeps you tired at the end of a day on which, if someone asked you, nothing much happened. Now place this diagnosis against the life you have actually been living. You have been trying to end the ache by getting the relationship, and the job, and the house, and the body, and the feeling of being approved of, and the feeling of being safe. The getting has worked, sometimes, for a little while. The relationship arrives, and there are 3 weeks in which the getting seems to have done its job. The promotion arrives, and there are 3 days. The good meal ends, and there are 3 bites. Something you may have spent a long time pretending not to notice is that the period of having it is always shorter than the period of having wanted it. That is not a flaw in you. That is the mechanism showing you what it is. Every arrival contains, already folded into it, the seed of the next reaching. The mind that was reaching for this is the same mind that, the moment this is secured, begins reaching for the next thing. The reaching is not a response to the absence. The reaching is the habit of the mind. The absence is the story the mind tells itself to justify the reaching it was going to do anyway. Let the weight of this settle for a moment. For your entire life, you have believed that if you could just get the right thing to stay, the reaching would stop. The teaching is telling you, with no unkindness, that the reaching was never going to stop by getting. The reaching is what the mind does. The mind does it the way the heart beats and the lungs breathe, as a constant background activity, and the only way it ever truly quiets is when the mind itself is trained to notice what it is doing. There is a passage in the old texts that describes what it is like to finally see this clearly. The mind, it is said, is like a monkey moving through a forest. It does not pause. It lets go of one branch only by taking hold of the next. For as long as it can see a branch within reach, it will move toward that branch. It cannot be still, not because stillness is forbidden, but because the habit of reaching is so deep that the monkey does not know how to do anything else. You have been the monkey for as long as you have been alive. You have moved from branch to branch so continuously that you have never quite stopped long enough to notice the reaching itself. You have noticed the branches. You have noticed which ones held and which ones broke. You have not noticed the hand that keeps reaching. The noticing, when it finally arrives, is not a punishment. The noticing is the first moment of freedom this teaching offers. If the reaching is what is generating the ache, and if the reaching can be seen for what it is, then something is possible that was not possible before the seeing. The reaching can be met. It can be watched. It can, slowly, over a long time, be allowed to loosen. This is where a lot of first-time listeners arrive at a relieved confusion. If the reaching is the problem, does that mean I should stop wanting things? Does the teaching require me to become a person with no desires? The answer is quieter than the question expects. The teaching is not asking you to empty yourself of preferences. It is asking you to see what kind of reaching is happening at any given moment, and whether that reaching is doing what you think it is doing. You can still want the job. You can still want the conversation to go well. You can still want the evening to be good. The training is in noticing what the wanting is costing you, and whether the wanting is the thing that is actually making the evening less good. Very often it is. The evening was fine. The reaching for it to be something slightly different was what made it feel tired by 9 o'clock. Come back, now, to the Sunday afternoon we stood inside in the last section. The wedding is over. The house is quiet. You are holding a cup of tea that is already getting cold. You can now see, with a precision you did not have an hour ago, that the flat feeling in the room is not the absence of the wedding. The flat feeling is the mind reaching for the wedding to still be happening, or reaching for the next thing it can look forward to, or reaching, very quietly, for this afternoon to already be over. The afternoon was never the problem. The afternoon is an afternoon. There is a particular light coming through the window. There are petals on the floor. There is a cup of tea that is cooling. There is the particular quality of silence a room has when it has been full and is now empty. There is your own breathing, which is going to continue whether or not you pay attention to it. when the reaching softens, even a little, what is left is an ordinary Sunday afternoon, which turns out to be a completely livable thing. This is the quiet good news inside the teaching about thirst. The ache has been generated by something. The something is not outside you. The something is not the circumstances. The something is a motion of mind that has been running you for a long time. And a motion of mind is the kind of thing that can be trained. Slowly, gently, over years, if needed. The training is the whole of the rest of the path. Before we walk further, there is one more distinction to draw. Because if you hear what has been said so far and take it at face value, you might conclude that every unpleasant feeling in your life is your fault for reaching. That is not what is being said. Some of the hard things that have happened to you were not generated by your reaching. The illness, the loss, the betrayal, the thing no one should have had to live through. The tradition is not going to tell you those were your responsibility. What the tradition is going to tell you is something more careful and more useful. The pain that came from outside you was one thing. What the mind did with it afterward was another. The two are not the same, and a great deal of the suffering you have carried for years has lived in the second place, not the first. This is a line worth sitting with for a moment, because the tradition will hand it to you in the next breath, in one of the clearest images any teacher has ever offered. An image of an arrow, then a second arrow, and a simple question about which of the two is really doing the damage you have blamed on the first. The arrow arrives. In the tradition, this image comes in its own short, austere text, no longer than a page, and the precision of it has kept teachers returning to it for 2,500 years. The Buddha said, an untrained person, when they are struck by a painful feeling, weeps, beats their chest, and falls into bewilderment. They experience two pains. First, the pain of the feeling itself, and then a second pain, which is the pain of their resistance to the first pain. It is as if, he said, a man had been struck by an arrow, and then, while the first arrow was still in him, a second arrow came and struck him in the same place. This is one of the few teachings in the whole tradition that lands in most listeners the first time they hear it, because the image is so physically clear. You can feel, in your own body, what it would be to be hit a second time where you were already wounded. You can feel which of the two arrows is doing the deeper damage. The first arrow is life. The first arrow is the thing that arrived. The headache, the phone call with bad news, the argument that ended badly, the ache in the chest that arrived on a Tuesday morning for no reason you can name. The first arrow lands, and something in the body registers it, and it hurts. This part of the pain is not negotiable. The tradition will not try to tell you that the first arrow is an illusion. The second arrow is what the mind does with the first one. The second arrow is the phrase that arrives after the sensation. Why is this happening to me? I cannot take this. This is never going to stop. It is always going to be like this. I must have done something to deserve this. Other people do not have to deal with this. The second arrow is the whole cloud of thought that begins to gather around the first pain, sometimes within seconds of the first pain arriving, sometimes so fast you do not notice the first one as a thing separate from the second. And yet they are entirely separate. The first arrow is a sensation. The second arrow is a story. The first arrow is what is actually happening in this moment. The second arrow is what the mind is building on top of it. The first arrow lasts as long as the sensation lasts, which is often far shorter than you would think. The second arrow can last for decades. Look at your own week. You had a difficult conversation on Monday. The actual conversation was 12 minutes long. The difficulty, as you lived it in your body, was acute for about those 12 minutes. Now count the hours you have spent since Monday, replaying the conversation, wording your response differently in your head, wondering what they meant by the sentence at minute 9, deciding how you will behave when you next see them, deciding whether you will say something, deciding you will not, deciding you will. Those hours are the second arrow. The 12 minutes were real. Life produced those. The 30 hours that followed were produced by the mind. They are not less painful for being mind-produced. In fact, they are usually more painful because they continue after the circumstance has ended, and they shape the nervous system, and they arrive again the next time anything even slightly similar happens. This is not the same as saying the 30 hours were your fault. The mind does what it learned to do a long time ago, usually before you had any say in the matter. Someone raised you. Someone was not always patient when they raised you. Someone taught you, by example, that when the first arrow lands, you should tense and rehearse and solve and fortify. The second arrow habit is a survival response that served you somewhere, probably before you were old enough to understand it. It is not a moral failure. It is a pattern. Patterns can be seen, and what can be seen can begin to loosen. That, all by itself, is already worth much of the rest of this training. Sit with a simple example. You wake up with a headache. That is the first arrow. Within a few seconds, almost without your choosing it, the second arrow begins to arrive. This is going to ruin the day. I cannot do the meeting like this. Why do I keep getting these? I must be dehydrated. I must be stressed. I must be dying. The meeting is going to be terrible. They are going to notice I am not myself. I am going to lose the account. By the time the kettle has boiled, the headache is still present, and so is a forecast of disaster that has nothing to do with the headache and everything to do with the habit of adding the second arrow. Now try a small experiment. Notice, if you can, the moment the second arrow arrives. You do not have to fight it. You do not have to believe it. You do not even have to argue with it. You only have to notice, with a friendly clarity, that it has arrived and that it is an arrow distinct from the first one. That noticing changes something small and important. For a moment, the pain of the headache is available to you as the pain of the headache. No forecast, no catastrophe, just a specific sensation in a specific region of the head, lasting for the length of time that this particular headache is going to last. You may be surprised to find how much more bearable the first arrow is when it is alone. The body can tolerate an enormous amount of sensation when the mind is not layering interpretation on top of it. What overwhelms you most days is not the size of the sensation. It is the size of the story you have built around the sensation. The tradition has a plain way of putting this. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Those two sentences are often quoted carelessly and can sound glib and sometimes land on people who are in real pain in a way that feels dismissive. Heard precisely, they do not mean that. They mean that there is one thing that comes to you from outside, which is the sensation, the event, the loss, the condition. And there is another thing that is produced inside, in response, which is the story you build about what the first thing means. The first thing you cannot always choose. The second thing, slowly, through training, you can begin to. There is a quiet radicalism in that sentence. For most of your life, you have believed that your suffering was caused by what happened to you. You have believed that if only the circumstances had been different, your inner life would have been different. The tradition is not contradicting that entirely. Circumstances matter. Some circumstances are harder to bear than others, and the tradition will not pretend otherwise. What it is saying is that a significant portion of what you have been carrying, day after day, has not been the circumstance. It has been the second arrow. And the second arrow, being of the mind, is responsive to the mind. It is responsive to the noticing of it. It is responsive to the softening around it. It is responsive, slowly, to the decision to stop believing everything it says. Come back to the headache. You are now making tea with a headache. You have noticed the forecast of disaster. You have not tried to talk yourself out of it. You have simply recognized it as the second arrow. The forecast thins because it was never real to begin with. The headache is still there. The tea is still warm in your hands. The morning is still the morning it was. You are, perhaps for the first time in a long time, having a headache without also having a small war about it. This is what the tradition means by the end of suffering, in its most basic and most daily form. It does not mean the end of pain. The body will still have headaches. The heart will still have its losses. The bad phone calls will still come. What ends, slowly, across years of training, is the second arrow. The addition, the cloud of thought that turned a sensation into a catastrophe. It is a quieter freedom than most people imagine when they hear Buddhist language about the end of suffering. It is not a place of permanent bliss. It is a place where, when the first arrow arrives, you feel it cleanly as the first arrow, and you are not also bleeding from a second wound that never actually hit your body. For most of your life, you have been walking through the world as though there were arrows coming at you from every direction. Many of them were never coming. Many of them were coming, but arrived less sharply than you feared. Many of them were coming, and did land, and the first sting was real, and then you added 6 more arrows of your own, from behind, and walked around with all 7 as though they had all come from the world. There is a way of living in which you carry only the arrows that were actually fired at you. That is already, by itself, a profound softening of a life. The arrows from the world are fewer than you think. The arrows from the mind, once seen, begin to drop away on their own. You may have come to this teaching expecting something more elevated. Something about awakening, or the bright, clear space of mind, or some condition of pure presence that the accomplished ones live inside. Those things exist in the tradition, and they will have their place. What the Buddha offered first, and what the tradition has always returned to first, is this astonishingly ordinary instruction. When life fires its arrow, feel the arrow. Do not shoot yourself with a second one. That instruction, held for one day, changes the texture of the day. Held for a week, changes the texture of the week. Held for a decade, changes a life. The training is nothing more elaborate and nothing less profound than learning to notice when the second arrow is leaving your own hand. In the next breath, the tradition will take you further than this. It will show you that even the end of the second arrow is not the last freedom. There is a further freedom, the one the Buddha described as peace, as coolness, as release. It has a name that has traveled almost as widely as the first one, and it has been misunderstood even more thoroughly. It is called Nirvana, and almost everything you have been told about it is a little bit off. The word arrives with a weight you did not place on it. It has been in films, and on the covers of albums, and on the walls of therapy rooms, and in the advertising for vacation packages that promise it by the weekend. By the time you meet it in a Buddhist context, it has already been coated with other people's associations. Paradise, a heaven for the enlightened, a state of permanent happiness unrelated to anything happening in your actual day. Something you get to if you sit on enough cushions. Each of those associations carries a little truth, and each of them, at the same time, has moved the meaning slightly off-center from what the man under the tree was actually pointing at. The word in the old texts is not a travel brochure. It is not a description of an altered state that descends on you after enough effort. It is a clinical, almost physical term, and the physicality of it is what has been lost in translation. Set almost all of that down. Not because those associations are cruel, but because they have quietly obscured the teaching that was there from the beginning, which is far quieter, far more immediate, and far more available to you on a Thursday afternoon than anything the word has been made to mean. Nirvana, in the language he spoke, is a word about fire. Specifically, it is the word for what a fire does when it goes out. The cooling, the settling of what was burning into what is no longer burning. If you have ever sat by a fireplace and watched the last red of the embers soften to grey, you have watched something of the image the word was built on. Remember the hillside outside Gaya. Remember the fire-tending ascetics who had been told that everything was burning. The fires of craving. The fires of aversion. The fires of not seeing clearly. Those fires were the reaching, the pushing away, and the habitual misreading of the mind. Nirvana is the name for what happens when those fires are no longer being fed. It is not a place. It is not a destination. It is not the name of a better life you go to once you have earned enough meditation points. It is the name of a quality that appears in the mind when the mind stops doing three things it has been doing for as long as you can remember. Stop reaching. Stop pushing away. Stop misreading what is in front of you. When those three motions soften, even for a moment, what is present in their absence is what the tradition has been pointing at with the word Nirvana for 2,500 years. You may have glimpsed it already. You did not know to call it anything. It was a walk at dusk, maybe when the light was doing something particular over the roofs, and for a moment there was no reaching for the evening to be different, and no pushing away of anything, and no small commentary running underneath. There was just the light, and the cold air, and the walking. That moment was not magic. That moment was a temporary cooling of the three fires that have been running your system since before you had a name. Or it was the afternoon you sat with a grief you expected to drown in and found, to your surprise, that it moved through you and out the other side without your having to do anything clever. Or it was the hour after a long piece of work was finished and you were too tired to reach for the next thing, and the room had an unfamiliar quiet in it that was not boredom, not emptiness, not relief. Something else, something ordinary and almost bashful, as if the mind had temporarily forgotten its usual job. The tradition holds that the cooling can be deepened. The tradition holds that what arrives briefly in that moment on the walk can, with long and careful training, arrive more often, stay longer, and finally settle as the ordinary background of a life. That deeper settling is what the texts are pointing at when they use the word nirvana in its fullest sense. There is a short collection of passages in the oldest layer of the texts in which the Buddha tries to describe this condition to his students. He is careful in the way he does it. He knows that any positive description will become a thing to grasp after, and that any negative description will sound like a denial of life. So he speaks around the edges of the thing. He uses a technique that will feel strange to a modern ear used to clear definitions. He describes the condition by listing what it is not, and then listing the few things it is comparable to, and then falling into silence. Any of his listeners who were still trying to turn the silence into a clear picture were, he knew, missing the point. The silence was part of the teaching. There is, he says, an unborn, an unmade, an uncompounded. If there were not an unborn, there would be no escape from the born. Because there is an unborn, an escape is known. The sentences are strange at first reading. They do not describe. They point. They are telling you that there is something in the structure of reality that is not the same as the rising and passing of ordinary conditioned experience. Not a separate place. Not a separate world. Something that becomes available when the reaching stops. The stillness that was always already present underneath the noise. You do not need to decide right now whether you believe in such a stillness. The tradition is not asking for a belief. The tradition is describing something that has been tasted by enough listeners over enough centuries that it has been considered worth pointing at. Your test of it will come, if it comes, in your own experience, on a walk, or in a meditation, or in a moment when the house is quiet and you have, for no discernible reason, stopped reaching. This is where the most common misunderstanding of the word takes hold. A listener hears nirvana, pictures a state of blissful oblivion, and concludes that the goal of Buddhist practice is to check out of life, to become numb, to stop caring, to reach a condition in which nothing moves you anymore. Nothing could be further from what the tradition is pointing at. The condition the Buddha described is not a numbing. It is the opposite of a numbing. It is what is present when the things that usually numb you have softened. The reaching is a numbing. The pushing away is a numbing. The constant commentary is a numbing. When those three thin, what emerges is a quality of presence so full and so immediate that most people, the first time they taste it, feel as though they have only now begun to be alive. The teachers in the tradition have been careful about overselling this. They will tell you that ordinary life still has its texture. A body is still a body. A meal still tastes like a meal. Pain still arrives in the shape of pain. What is different is that the second arrow no longer lands, and the reaching no longer runs underneath every moment, and the pushing away no longer arrives before the experience itself. The texture of life becomes itself. For your purposes, sitting in whatever room you are sitting in tonight, the word can be taken as a pointer to the direction the training moves in. Each time you notice the second arrow and let it drop, the fires are, for that moment, less fed. Each time you sit with a difficult feeling without reaching to fix it or push it away, the fires are, for that moment, less fed. Each time you see that the thing your mind is telling you about a situation is not the situation, the fires are, for that moment, less fed. Over many such moments, across many months and years, the fires begin to have less of their own fuel. The cooling becomes an ordinary fact of your morning. The cooling becomes something your body recognizes before the mind has named it. You wake with less of the forecast. You speak with less of the rehearsing. You hold a difficult conversation with less of a reaching to win it. This is not dramatic. No one will look at you and know that anything has shifted. The changes are interior, small, cumulative, and compound quietly over the years in the way that a healthy habit of walking eventually changes the shape of a body. The tradition calls this the gradual path. It is the most reliable path human beings have ever been handed. This is Nirvana in its most daily and most available meaning. It is not elsewhere. It is not later. It is not reserved for the advanced. It is what is already happening, in small flickers, whenever the three fires momentarily relent. There is a story about the Buddha meeting a skeptic who asked him, after his awakening, what he had become. "Are you a god?" the man asked. "Are you an angel? Are you a spirit?" The Buddha said no to each. Finally, the man asked, "Then what are you?" And the Buddha said, "I am awake." The answer is often quoted and often heard as mystical, as though he were claiming some rarefied status. He was not. The word he used was the plainest word he could have chosen. It was the same word you would use about a child who has just opened their eyes in the morning. The condition he was describing was not elsewhere and not elevated. It was the ordinary waking of a mind that had stopped dreaming itself into suffering. The word awake was not a title. The word was a description. He was, more accurately than most people can claim, awake to what was actually in the room. He was not reaching for the room to be different. He was not pushing the room away. He was not running his usual script about the room. He was where he was, with what was there. That is the awake condition. That is the nirvana the tradition has been pointing at. You can begin approaching it tonight, not by adopting the posture of an accomplished meditator, not by fixing anything about yourself first. You can begin by noticing, in one ordinary moment, the reaching, the pushing away, and the commentary. Notice how continuous they are. Notice how they do their work without asking your permission. Notice, in that very noticing, that there is something in you already capable of standing slightly behind them. That something is already closer to nirvana than most of the words you have been handed about it. It is the quiet observer who has been inside you for every moment of your life, watching the reaching and the resisting come and go. The training is not about constructing that observer. The training is about remembering, more and more often, that it is already here. There is one last thing to say about the word before we walk on. The tradition, in its honesty, has not tried to pretend that what it is pointing at can be fully captured in speech. The best teachers have always used pointing language, not describing language. They have asked you to look where their finger is pointing, rather than to study the finger. So set the word down lightly. Take the image of the cooling fire, and take the memory of the walk at dusk when the mind briefly relented, and take the felt sense of the quiet observer who has always been here, and let those three things stand in for the word until your own experience fills it out more fully. We have now, in 4 movements, walked the 4 great truths he offered that morning under the tree. There is the unsatisfactoriness. There is the reaching that causes it. There is the cessation, which is the cooling of the reaching. And there is the path. The path is the last of them and the most practical. It is the part of the teaching that tells you, in plain terms, how to begin feeding the fires a little less each day, how to orient a whole life around the slow softening of the reaching, how to walk, eat, speak, work, and rest in a way that cools instead of stokes. The tradition does not present the path as a rigid list you tick off. It presents it as 8 overlapping practices that support each other, so that beginning anywhere on the list is, eventually, beginning everywhere. The 8 are not steps. They are facets of one orientation, a single clear way of being in the world, described from 8 different angles so that a listener entering from any direction can find a way in. That is the next part of this walk. It is the part that turns a beautiful diagnosis into an actual life. A path is not a staircase. A staircase presumes an order, a numbering, a failure state where if you miss step 3, step 4 is closed to you. A path is something else entirely. A path is a direction held in the whole body, and many different feet have walked many different rhythms along it, and the direction does not depend on any particular first step. The tradition calls what he offered the eightfold path. 8 is the number of its facets, not the number of its stages. A better image than a list is a wheel with 8 spokes, every spoke turning at the same time, every spoke making the same wheel. You can put your weight on any one of the spokes, and the wheel turns. You can start from where you are. This is the first piece of good news about the path. You will not be graded on whether you began with the right one. The one that calls to you on any given day is the one you should begin with. Tomorrow it may be a different one. Next year it may be the one you cannot imagine wanting today. The wheel carries you by being walked, and the walking is not fussy about where the first footfall lands. The 8 facets have names, and the names have been translated into English with varying grace over the years. Some translations use the word right in front of each, as in right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The word right has caused trouble. It sounds moralistic. It sounds like a child being corrected. The original word means something closer to skillful, fitting, appropriate, aligned with what actually reduces suffering. Hear the 8 with that softer word in place of right, and the flavor of the path changes. Skillful view, skillful intention, skillful speech, skillful action, skillful livelihood, skillful effort, skillful mindfulness, skillful concentration. Nothing here is about being a good person in the way a school report measures goodness. Everything here is about what you will actually do in the hours of a day to stop feeding the 3 fires. Skillful view is the first facet, and it is the orientation the rest of the wheel turns inside. It is the quiet recognition of what was said in the 4 great truths. That conditions cannot hold the weight you have been trying to put on them. That the reaching is what generates the ache. That the ache can be ended by training the mind that is doing the reaching. That there is a path for doing so. Skillful view is not a belief you must sign up to. It is a way of looking at your own experience that matches how the experience actually behaves when you look carefully. Skillful intention is the second. It is the direction of your deepest wanting, not the surface wants that come and go with the weather of your mood, but the quieter wanting underneath them, the wanting to harm less, the wanting to be kinder than the version of yourself that shows up when you are tired, the wanting to see clearly, the wanting to stop running the old programs. Intention is what orients the whole of the rest of the day, and the tradition asks you, gently, to notice what your actual intentions are, rather than the ones you have been told you should have. Skillful speech is where a lot of first-time listeners realize that this path is not going to let them off the hook in ordinary life. It is the practice of choosing, in small moments, what comes out of your mouth and what does not. Not a vow of perfect honesty from tomorrow morning. A slow training. A noticing of when you are about to sharpen a sentence to win a point. A softening of the comments you make about people who are not in the room. A steady reduction of the gossip, the small cruelties, the unnecessary lies that you had barely noticed you were telling. Pay attention to your own speech for a single day, and you will see how much of the path lives in this facet alone. The tradition says that a life can be reshaped from speech onwards, because what you say to others and to yourself is the air that the mind breathes. Change the air, and the mind changes. This is not a metaphor. It is how minds actually work. Skillful action is speech extended into what you do with your hands and your time. It includes the precepts that have run through every Buddhist tradition for 2,500 years. Do not kill. Do not take what is not freely given. Do not cause harm in sexual conduct. Do not speak falsely. Do not cloud the mind with intoxication. The precepts are often heard as rules. They are, more accurately, a description of what a life looks like when it has stopped feeding the fires. When craving softens, the actions described by the precepts become easier to avoid. Not because you are suppressing anything, because the heat that produced them is no longer as high. Skillful livelihood is a practical facet that modern translators sometimes underplay. It is the recognition that how you earn your living is not separate from the path. The 8 hours a day you spend making a living shape your mind more than any meditation you do in the remaining time. If those hours are built on deception, or on causing quiet harm to people who are not in the room, or on the degradation of the world, the mind is being trained, for those hours, in the opposite direction from the one the path is pointing. The tradition does not demand that every listener leave their job tomorrow. It asks you to look, honestly, at what your work is doing to you, and whether there is a skillful direction you could, over time, move toward. Skillful effort is the facet that saves the path from becoming a rigid exercise. It is the art of knowing when to press and when to release, when to lean into the practice and when to rest, when to hold a precept firmly and when to let a small slip go and start again in the next hour. A great deal of spiritual effort is wasted in over-effort, which is itself a form of reaching, which is itself the fire the path is trying to cool. Skillful effort is effort that does not stoke the thing it is trying to reduce. You will meet this facet in your own body. You will try too hard on a Wednesday and find by Thursday you have lost the whole thread. You will then try too little on the Friday and find by Sunday you have lost it in the other direction. Over time, the body learns an effort that is neither clenched nor slack. That middle place, found and lost and found again, is skillful effort. Skillful mindfulness is the facet most listeners think of when they hear the word Buddhism, because it has been carried into many modern wellness traditions. In its original form, it is both simpler and more demanding than the pared-down version. It is the ongoing practice of noticing what is actually happening in your experience, as it is happening, without the second arrow, without the forecast, without the rehearsal. The Buddha described it as the practice of being clearly aware of the body, of feelings, of the states of the mind, and of the processes that keep arising in the mind and passing away again. This is not a state you enter for 20 minutes on a cushion. It is a relationship to your own experience that can be practiced in any posture. While you are walking, while you are eating, while you are standing at a kettle waiting for water to boil, the posture matters less than the clarity of the noticing. The cushion matters less than whether, right now, you can feel your breath in your chest. Skillful concentration is the last facet and the most often misunderstood. It is not a mental athletics. It is not the ability to stare at a dot on a wall for 40 minutes without blinking. It is the gathered quality of a mind that has been steadied enough by the other 7 facets that it can rest on one thing at a time. The gathering is cumulative. It is the natural fruit of the other practices. When speech is less scattered, the mind is less scattered. When livelihood is less divided, the mind is less divided. When effort is not frantic, the mind can settle. Return to the image of the wheel. The 8 spokes are not separate. They hold each other up. Skillful speech supports skillful concentration, because a mind full of things it should not have said cannot easily rest on its breath. Skillful view supports skillful intention, because without seeing the way things actually behave, you cannot deeply want to align with how they behave. Every facet is a small support for every other facet. This is why the tradition says, begin anywhere, and you have begun everywhere. If you commit tonight to noticing one facet in your own life for a week, you will find that the others begin to shift on their own. Take mindfulness, and speech begins to clean itself up. Take speech, and concentration begins to deepen. Take view, and effort stops being frantic. The wheel turns together. Do not misunderstand this as ease. The path is not hard in the way that climbing a mountain is hard. It is hard in the way that unlearning something you have done for 30 years is hard. It is patient, slow, sometimes discouraging work, and it asks you to begin again many times. The tradition has always known this. The teaching is designed for a person who falls off the path, notices they have fallen off, and steps back onto it without making a drama of either the falling or the returning. There is a passage in the tradition that describes this patience beautifully. A student asked a teacher, "How long will it take for me to be awake?" The teacher said, "If you ask that question, a long time. If you stop asking and simply walk, a short time." The answer sounds like a riddle. It is not a riddle. It is a practical observation. The asking about how long is itself one of the fires. It is a form of reaching for the end of the path instead of walking it. The reaching keeps the fire burning. The walking lets it cool. What does walking look like for you? It looks like a single week in which you notice what your mind is actually doing. It looks like a single conversation in which you choose to soften a sentence you were about to sharpen. It looks like a single evening in which you sit with what is already here, rather than reaching for the next thing. It looks like a single afternoon in which you do the work in front of you, instead of composing an imaginary version of a future afternoon. It looks like a morning in which you drink your tea slowly, and taste it, and do not reach for your phone in the first 3 minutes of being awake. It looks like a small honesty in a moment when a small untruth would have been easier. It looks like the choice, on an ordinary Tuesday, not to say the cutting thing you could have said. Nothing on that list is dramatic. Nothing on that list requires a retreat, a robe, or a tradition you were not raised in. You can begin, literally, in the hour after this video ends. You can begin by noticing, as you turn away from this screen, which of the 3 fires is already quietly running. That noticing is already the first spoke of the wheel beginning to turn. You are not starting from scratch. You were not neutral before this evening. You have been doing things that have fed the fires and things that have softened them your whole life, without the vocabulary to name either. Tonight you have a vocabulary. Tomorrow you have a way of looking. The week after, perhaps a small change in how you speak. The year after, perhaps a different shape of evening. The decade after, perhaps a life that has been quietly and deeply rearranged by the slow turning of a wheel you did not always notice was turning. There is still one more thing to hold carefully before the path makes full sense. The whole machinery of the wheel depends on something we have not yet looked at directly. It depends on what you intend. It depends on the small flicker of volition behind every action, every word, every choice of where to put your attention. The tradition has a precise word for that flicker and a precise teaching about what it does across a life. That teaching has been badly translated in the modern West and badly understood as a grand accounting system. In its original form, it is something far closer, far quieter, and far more useful. A word has been traveling toward you through all of this training, and it is time to let it land. The word is karma. Almost everything you have been told about karma is a little bit off, and some of it is off in ways that have been harmful to the people who believed it. The word has been made into an accounting system in the modern mind, a ledger in the sky tracking your deeds, a great court in the sky that rewards the good and punishes the bad, a reason that children get sick and good people lose their jobs. The tradition does not teach that. The tradition never taught that. What it taught is at once simpler and far more rigorous, and it begins with a single sentence the Buddha gave in a text called the Nibbedika Sutta. The sentence is this: "It is intention," he said, "that I call karma." That is the whole heart of the teaching in a single breath. Karma is not what happens to you. Karma is not the event. Karma is not the accident, the illness, the loss, the stroke of luck. Karma is the flicker of volition inside you that produces the actions you take. The small movement of the heart that says yes, or no, or reach, or speak, or stay silent. The tradition has a precise word for that flicker. It is called cetana, and it means intention, volition, the inward leaning toward an act that comes a fraction of a second before the act itself. This changes everything you thought karma was. It is not about the sky rewarding or punishing you. It is about what you are doing 1,000 times a day to the mind you will have tomorrow. Consider what the tradition is actually claiming here. Every time you form an intention and act on it, you leave a small residue inside yourself. The residue is the faint deepening of the groove that produced the intention. Do something cruel, and the groove for cruelty is a little easier to fall into next time. Do something kind, and the groove for kindness is a little easier to fall into next time. Over years, over decades, these grooves become the shape of the mind. What you have been practicing, moment by moment, has been slowly becoming what you are. This is why the tradition says, with great care, that you become what you intend. Not what you think, not what you say you believe, what you actually lean toward 1,000 times in the ordinary hours of an ordinary life. Sit for a moment with how ordinary the evidence is. The person in your life who has become warm over the years did not take a course in warmth. They practiced it in small moments for a long time. The person who has become bitter did not decide one day to be bitter. They practiced bitterness in small moments for a long time. Neither of them was aware, probably, that practicing was what they were doing. But a mind cannot lean in a direction 100,000 times without becoming that leaning. This is the real teaching of karma. You are, right now, being made by the intentions you are forming. The comment you almost made but did not. the moment of patience you chose when you were tired, the small dishonesty you let slide in yourself because no one saw it, the kindness you performed when there was no one watching. These are not separate from who you are becoming. They are the mechanism by which you are becoming. The Buddha gave a long piece of advice on this to his own son, Rahula, in a text preserved in the middle-length discourses. He was speaking to a child, so he used the plainest possible language. Before you act, he said, look at what you are about to do and ask whether it will harm yourself or harm another or harm both. While you act, look at what you are doing and ask the same question. After you have acted, look at what you have done and ask the same question. If the answer is harm, step away from the action and do differently next time. If the answer is no harm, continue. There is no metaphysics in that instruction. There is no ledger in the sky. There is a person, a moment, an intention, an action, and a quiet asking of a question. The tradition is training you to examine the small volitions of your own day, because those are what you can change. Notice what the tradition is not asking. It is not asking you to be perfectly good. It is not asking you to never form a cruel intention again. It is asking you to look at the intentions that arise, to see them clearly, and to notice which ones produce harm. The seeing, over time, is what changes the grooves. You do not have to force yourself into goodness. You have to keep looking at what you are actually doing, and a surprising amount of the rest takes care of itself. This brings us back to why the modern reading of karma has been so quietly damaging. If you believe that karma is a great accounting system in the sky, then when something terrible happens to you, you will search for what you did to deserve it. This is a wound the tradition never wanted to inflict. A child who dies of a disease did not deserve that disease. A man who loses his job in a recession is not being punished from above for a hidden sin. These framings belong to a garbled version of the teaching that has drifted a long way from what was actually taught. What the tradition actually teaches is gentler and more useful and more demanding. It teaches that the things that happen to you come from many causes, most of them not yours. The weather of a day, the state of the economy, the decisions of people you have never met, the body you were born into, the country, the century, the luck. What is yours is the small strand of intention that runs through the events. What you do with the luck, what you do with the weather, how you form an intention in response to what arrives. That strand is small, but it is the one thread in the whole tapestry that actually belongs to you. Over a life, the thread becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes a person. You are, right now, being shaped by the 1,000 small volitions you have formed this week. The small refusal to speak honestly, the small decision to speak honestly, the small moment of reaching for a distraction, the small moment of staying with what was actually in the room, the small leaning toward resentment against someone who wronged you, the small leaning toward releasing the grip, just by a fraction, on the grievance you have been holding. None of these are dramatic. None would show up on the surface of the week if someone asked you what happened. And yet they are the real work. They are what is quietly rearranging the person you will be at 40, at 60, at the hour of your death. This is also why the tradition places intention before action in its teaching. The action is the visible part, and the action has consequences in the world, which matter. But the inner work is happening a fraction of a second before the action, in the flicker, in the cetana. That is where the mind is being made. The action is the footprint. The intention is the foot. This has a practical consequence you can use. If you want to change the person you are becoming, the tradition does not ask you to change your biography, or your circumstances, or the people around you. It asks you to change the moment just before the action, to notice the flicker as it forms, and to see whether it leans toward harm or away from it, and to soften the ones that lean toward harm by the simple fact of seeing them. The seeing is itself a small act of kindness toward the future self you are in the process of becoming. The tradition holds a story about a man who had killed many people and who met the Buddha on a road and who spent the rest of his life practicing harmlessness instead of harm. Villagers still threw stones at him when he walked through their villages as a monk because they remembered what he had been. His past was not erased. The grooves he had worn into himself by years of killing did not vanish. What changed was the direction of every new intention he formed from that moment forward. By the end of his life, he was, by every description, a different person than the one who had walked into the forest. You are, of course, not that man. What you are trying to rewrite is smaller and quieter, a tendency to overreact when you are tired, a habit of speaking a little too sharply to the people closest to you, a reflex of grasping at approval from a person whose approval does not actually matter, a quiet dishonesty about something you have been unable to face. The mechanism is the same. Each of these is being practiced every day by a mind that does not always realize it is practicing. And each can, slowly, be replaced by a different leaning, one intention at a time. The tradition is very patient about how long this takes. It does not promise rapid transformation. It does not promise that by noticing your intentions for a week, you will become a new person. It promises, instead, that the direction of your life, which you have some power over, will begin to shift. A year from now, perhaps, you will speak a little more kindly. A decade from now, perhaps, you will be a person who is more often at ease in your own company. 30 years from now, perhaps, the grooves will be so different from where they began that people who knew you as a young person will say, quietly, that you have become someone. That becoming is karma in its real sense. It is not revenge from the sky. It is the slow sculpting of a mind by the intentions it forms, day after day, until the sculpture is what the person actually is. There is one more thing the tradition wants you to notice before we move on. The intentions you form are not always about other people. Many of the most important intentions you form this week will be about yourself. How you speak to yourself when you make a mistake. Whether you soften or harden when you notice a failing in your own character. Whether you look at your tiredness with some gentleness or with contempt. The tradition includes these in the count. The cruelty you direct at yourself is not less cruel for being private. The kindness you direct at yourself is not less kind for being unwitnessed. The grooves, in other words, are made by how you treat your own mind as much as by how you treat anyone else. To be forming intentions skillfully means, In part, being willing to stop attacking yourself in the small moments when an old habit would have you attack. The tradition considers this a form of the path, not a sentimental add-on to it. And that points toward the final piece we have not yet placed. The whole machinery of intention, of path, of fires cooling, of grooves reshaping, is incomplete without one element that runs underneath all of it. The tradition names it. Without this element, the teaching becomes a cold technical exercise, and the people who treat it that way often end up drier and harder than when they began. The element is warmth, the quality of the heart that makes all the rest of the training land in a person rather than skate across them. That is where the Buddha ends up pointing, in the last piece of training we will sit with tonight. The word is warmth. It is a small word for something the tradition treats as one of the central pillars of the whole training. Without it, every teaching you have heard tonight becomes something cold, a diagnosis without a hand on the shoulder, a set of instructions without a person giving them, a technically correct map of the mind held by someone who has stopped being able to feel their own heart beating. The tradition has seen this danger for 2,500 years. It has seen what happens when people take the analytical teachings and turn them into a kind of emotional armor. They sit very still. They speak in measured sentences. They observe their experience with a clinical detachment that feels, from the outside, like a corpse learning to breathe. They have become, in the tradition's own description, an empty house with very clean rooms. That is not the goal. The goal is a heart that sees clearly and still stays open, a mind that understands how things arise and pass, and does not use that understanding to stand apart from the people it lives with. A person who can look at impermanence without becoming hard about it. To understand why warmth is so central, we have to look briefly at what the tradition calls the 3 marks of existence. This is the analytical side of the training, the part that can easily become cold if it is held without heart. The Buddha named 3 qualities that run through all conditioned experience: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, no fixed self. Impermanence is the observation that everything you can point to is changing. The body you have now is not the body you had at 20. The mood you are in this afternoon is not the mood you were in this morning. The relationships in your life are moving, even when they seem steady. The city you live in is rearranging itself while you sleep. Nothing you have ever held has stayed exactly the way it was when you first held it. This is not a pessimism. It is a description of how things actually behave. The tradition is asking you to look directly at this, because your suffering has partly been the refusal to look at it. You have been trying, all your life, to build a stable home out of materials that were always in motion. Unsatisfactoriness is the second mark, and we have spent much of this video inside it. It is the quiet incompleteness of conditioned experience. The fact that even the best moments have a faint edge of wanting them to continue, or wanting them to have been longer, or wanting to capture them somehow. The conditions can hold pleasure for a while. They cannot hold you. The third mark is the one that most listeners find strange at first. It is called anatta, which is often translated as no self. Though the translation is misleading, the tradition is not saying you do not exist. It is saying that the solid, unchanging thing you think of as yourself is not actually there when you look for it. Try looking. Right now, if you search for the self that is listening, what do you find? You find a body. You find sensations. You find thoughts arising and passing. You find a name you have been using. You find a set of memories. You find a running commentary that calls itself I. What you do not find is a single fixed thing behind all of these that is the owner of the experience. There is experience. There is no one, in the way you had assumed, standing behind the experience and having it. This is one of the most demanding teachings in the tradition, and the least safe one to leave in the hands of a cold mind. A person who absorbs the teaching of no self without warmth can walk around telling themselves that other people are not really people, that suffering does not really matter, that nothing they do has any weight. The tradition has seen this distortion many times. It has a name for it. Spiritual bypass dressed up in ancient language. The teaching of no self, held with warmth, is something entirely different. It is the recognition that the rigid self you have been defending was never as solid as you thought, and that the softening of that rigidity opens a space in which other people can matter more, not less. When the fortress dissolves, the world gets closer. The person across from you is no longer an object on the other side of a wall. They are another arising of the same kind of experience you are having, and their pain is recognizable to you as your own. That recognition is warmth. The tradition has a specific training for this quality of heart, and it is one of the most beautiful things it gave us. It is called metta, a word usually translated as loving kindness, though the translation is a little soft. Metta is closer to a steady, adult wish for the well-being of beings, including yourself, held without expectation of return. There is a short discourse called the Karaniya Metta Sutta in which the Buddha gives instructions for this training. The language is plain. May all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there are, whether frail or strong, long or great, medium, short, small or large, seen or unseen, those who are near and those who are far, those who are born and those who are yet to be born, may all beings be at ease. Hear that list slowly. The Buddha is asking you to hold a warmth that is not discriminating. Not only the people you find easy, not only the ones who love you back, not only the ones in your own country or your own generation, the frail and the strong, the unseen, the ones yet to be born. The list is long on purpose. It is training the heart to keep opening where it would naturally contract. You may be feeling, at this point, that this is beyond you, that you cannot honestly wish well-being on every living thing, that there are people in your life for whom you do not feel anything like warmth. The tradition is not asking you to manufacture a feeling you do not have. It is asking you to begin in one small place and to extend, slowly, over years. The practice often begins with yourself. This is where many listeners find the first resistance. The phrase is straightforward. May I be well. May I be at ease. May I be free from suffering. And many people, hearing those phrases, find that something tightens in the chest. They do not, in any deep part of themselves, wish themselves well. They have been attacking their own minds for so long that kindness in that direction feels foreign. This is precisely why the tradition starts there. You cannot extend a warmth you have not practiced having for yourself. The warmth you direct outward is, in large part, the warmth you have built toward your own mind. If that practice is missing, the outward version becomes performative, or condescending, or brittle. Try it for a single breath now. Settle your attention on the fact that you are here, listening, tired in some way you have not named, carrying the accumulated weight of a life you did not fully choose. Not the person others know about you, the person inside, the one who does not always get spoken to kindly by you. And say, with no ceremony, "May I be well." Notice what happens. Notice whether you flinch. Notice whether something inside you resists even that small gesture. The flinch is information. It is showing you exactly where the warmth has not yet been practiced. After yourself, the tradition teaches you to extend the practice to someone who is easy, a person whose well-being you would want without effort, a grandmother, a child, a friend who has been steady with you. Say, "May they be well. May they be at ease." Notice how the phrase feels in the body when it is directed towards someone you already love. Remember that feeling, because it is what you are training the mind to produce in a widening radius. Next comes someone neutral. The clerk at the shop you visit, a neighbor you barely know, a stranger in a photograph. Hold them in mind and say the same phrase. May they be well. This is where the training begins to do real work, because it is here that you see how often the heart skips over the people who do not directly concern you. Then, more slowly, someone difficult. A colleague who has wronged you, a family member who has been unkind, a public figure whose behavior you find hard to stomach. The tradition knows this is the hard one. It does not ask you to approve of what they have done. It asks you to hold a small wish that they too, in their own confusion, might become less harmful, that they too might find some ease, that their fires might cool a little. This final step often feels impossible at first. It is not meant to be faked. If the wish does not land, you return to the easier circles and keep practicing. The capacity to wish well-being on a person who has hurt you is a slow capacity to build. The tradition is patient with how long it takes. What happens over years of this training is something the Buddha described with unusual warmth himself. The heart, he said, becomes boundless in all directions, above, below, around, without narrow hatreds and without closed places. It is one of the rare moments in the tradition where the language reaches for something close to lyrical. And notice what has happened in that training. The analytical teachings have been held inside a wide-open heart instead of a narrow one. Impermanence becomes tender rather than cold. No self becomes an opening rather than a dismissal. Suffering becomes something you have in common with every being who has ever lived, instead of a personal injustice. The same teachings, in a warm house, produce a very different kind of person. This is what the tradition means when it refuses to separate wisdom from warmth. A person trained only in seeing becomes sharp, perhaps, and clever, perhaps, and has very little to offer the people around them. A person trained only in warmth becomes well-meaning but unable to see what is actually happening, and their kindness misfires into sentimentality. The tradition has always asked for both. Two wings of a bird, either one alone and the bird circles on the ground. You have been walking with both wings tonight. The wisdom wing is everything you have heard about dukkha and thirst, and the two arrows, and nirvana, and the path, and intention. The warmth wing is the one we have just been holding. The quiet wish that beings, including yourself, become a little less burdened in the time they have. Neither wing will carry you alone. Together they make a different kind of life possible. Not a perfect life, not the end of all difficulty. A life in which the difficulty is met by a person whose heart has stayed open and whose eyes are clear. There is one more breath of teaching we will take before we stop. It is not a new doctrine. It is the gentle landing the Buddha left us with for the long hours of an ordinary life, when all the elaborate teaching has been set down and only the person and the breath and the day remain. This is what he left us. Not a doctrine to argue about, not a system to master. A handful of quiet observations about how a mind behaves, and a steady invitation to look for yourself and see whether they are true. The observations have survived 2,500 years because they have kept being confirmed by ordinary people in ordinary lives. The headache is still a headache. The second arrow still does most of the damage. The reaching still produces the ache. The warmth, practiced slowly, still changes a person over time. You do not have to become a Buddhist to take this with you. The teaching never needed the label. It only needed a person, quiet in a room, willing to look carefully at their own mind. That person, tonight, is you. It will do its work slowly, through the ordinary hours, in the small choices you make over the next day, the next week, the next year. Nothing dramatic needs to happen tonight. The listening is the beginning. May you be well. May you be at ease. May the fires slowly cool.